Okay, so this is a completely different part. It's a very practical set of advice for writing effective text. And the idea is to keep it in mind for the exercise afterwards, okay? So, first of all, what I said to her, I don't know your name, okay, before, that is, you learn to write by writing. So being a journalist is really kind of a craftsmanship. You don't theoretically learn how to do a chair or to make a chair. You learn it by making chairs. And I think journalism is the same. This is why internships are very useful. In my opinion, they are more useful than, for example, journalism masters, because they really give you the practical tools, okay? So before putting yourself at writing, and this I think is very important for the kind of things that you write, is try to identify specifically what you want to talk about. It is very easy when you are dealing with complex problems to ending up wanting to explain the more general, the broader perspective, but sometimes it's not a good strategy. You really need to talk of one subject at a time to convey a clear message, and then there will be other opportunities to talk about other issues. Then always before putting yourself at writing, two important things are the following. First of all, how I will write the story, how I will build my narration. There are different strategies. One very easy one is the chronological one, that is arrange the facts you want to tell in a chronological sequence, but there are other strategies that may be very relevant for the kind of subjects you cover. For example, not following a chronological sequence, but a sequence of locations. So something more similar to a movie. First you explain what's happening in one place, then in another place, then in another place. Other possible strategies are a logic argumentation, so you don't follow the chronological evolution, but the logic relation between elements, or a simple list, okay? And then, always before writing, it is very important to identify the relevant context. That is, I want to explain this subject, this issue. What are the things that I have to bring in to explain it? So what are the antecedents? What are the string of facts that bring to this fact? What are the events that will relate to this fact in the close future? So for example, if you are, if you are talking about, let's say, something related to climate change, and there will be a meeting on climate change in 1 month, it is very important to bring this into the article. What is the related research, and obviously what is the framing, the possible ideological framing or political framing of the issue. Then, once you have this information in mind, a paradigm that is used in journalism to order the information is the so-called inverted pyramid paradigm. If you're writing a scientific paper, usually you start with a background and then you develop an argumentation that reaches the conclusions, the results, the original part of your work. In journalism, the perspective is completely the opposite. You start with the result, you start with the news themes, you start with the conclusions, you start with the message you want to give, and then, in the end, you go to the background, okay? This is a very practical way of thinking when you want to put the information in order in an article. So, from the more interesting things, from the newer things, from the more attractive things to the less ones, okay? This could even be applied at a microscopic level. That is, if you have a set of things that you want to say, a practical way of ordering them is saying which is the more attractive one, which is the thing that it's newer, which is the real message that I want to give. I will say it first, okay? And then I will explain the background. Okay, now I wanted to show you short movie, piece of movie that explains, that tells a lot about what is the logic. It is taken from the front page, a very famous movie by Willy Wilder. I hope you will hear it. I close the door just a second. So they are in the newsroom and they are discussing about an article. So this is the head of the newspaper, this is a journalist, and he is asking him to read the beginning of his article. Okay? Okay, I don't know if you have understood it, but basically he's reading this, the lead of the article, the beginning of the article, and he's saying, okay, there has been a shooting, these people have died, and the director says, and don't you mention the Examiner, which is the newspaper that has discovered the story, and he said, wait, I will put it in the second paragraph, and the answer of the director is, who the hell is going to read the second paragraph, okay? So this is something that is interesting to keep in mind, really, who the hell's going to read the second paragraph? You may write a very long feature, but maybe people will read the title, the subheads, the subheads, and that's all, and maybe the first paragraph, okay? So this is a practical and cynical way of stating what I said before. Really start with the important thing. So this is an example of how news or a press release may be built. At the beginning of the text, it is really important to put what happens more. Journalist Peter Corrigan has a way of explaining it, which is the story of a friend on a hill. Imagine that you are running, you have very important news, you are running, and there is a friend on a hill, on top of a hill, and you have a very important thing to tell him or her. So you run, you get to the top of the hill, and you have enough voice only to say a sentence. That is the title. That sentence is the title, okay? Another way is the trailer. That is, another metaphor is the trailer. That is, this part of the article may be thought, should be thought, as the trailer of a movie. That is telling really the more attractive things, the most attractive things, because you want to convince the person to go to and see the movie. Or out of the metaphor, you want to convince him or her to follow reading the article. So, what are the things that matter? What are the important things? It depends a lot on what you are telling about, but something that certainly should be included in these initial parts of the article are the famous 5W and 1H, that is what, who, when, where, why, and how. That is, you don't always need to answer to all these questions, because sometimes the answer is trivial, it's obvious, it's not relevant, but it's a good check one can mentally do when you write the beginning of an article to check whether you have answered to all these questions. For example, if you are writing a press release on a publication, at a certain point of the beginning you have to explain who has published this, when it has been published, where, etc. And another very important thing in this part is to make it, to avoid interrupting the flow of the reading. That is, think that really readers don't have a lot of time, there is a lot of competing information, so putting here something that makes the reading difficult, it's not a very good strategy, because it may be that the reader finds it difficult to interpret this first paragraph and decide to move to another one, okay? So for example, in academic coverage, there is a big temptation to start saying the Institute of Science and Technology and the Environment has published in this newspaper, in this magazine, publication authored by this and this person, and then you say, what is the result? Bad strategy, because nobody's interested in this, it makes a lot of difficulty, so maybe you have to tell it, but don't start with this, okay? It's better to go to the spot. Then, once and if you have managed to get the person reading the second paragraph, which means that roughly it will be 10% of the people that has read the first one, an important thing is not to disappoint the reader. I mean, if you have created interest here, try to keep it here, okay? So if you have put here the most important thing, put here the second most important thing, or the second most attractive thing. For example, a strategy that sometimes is used, not much in news and press releases, but in features, is to put here, to start the second paragraph or the second block with a quotation, a quote, sorry. Because usually if the quote is good, if it's attractive, it's a way of breaking the rhythm and stirring the attention of the reader. Then you have the rest of the text, which will be read probably by 10% of 10%, okay? How do you structure the text, the rest of the text? As I said before, it's very important to think in advance a strategy, a sequence, how you will tell your story. As a chronologic story, as a list of ideas, as a logic sequence of things, as a list of places. And one thing that is forbidden is to mix things. Maybe you have a story or 2 or 3 different stories that develop in parallel. It's better to explain each one separately in a different block than to explain them in parallel, because this will create a lot of confusion. So, for example, if, look here, if you have 2 different point of views on the same issue, it's better to put them close. Not to explain one point of view, then go to another issue, and then explain the second point of view. It's better to have them close so that the reader understands the differences. Other thing to be taken into account, once you have given the main important information, then you have introduced the quote and you have given the second important information, then maybe you can use the third paragraph or the third block to give some context, okay, to give some background. Another element that can happen are the so-called dead ends. That is, in your narration, you may have a side thing to explain that is, for example, a detail or something like this. If you have this kind of side things that break the flow of the narration, it is better either to put them at the end or to put before a subhead. So you can break the flow with these kind of little titles. In Spanish they are called ladillos, that are mainly useful for this kind of things. That is, you make a deviation, then through the subhead you go back to the story. And obviously avoid an abrupt conclusion. Is the coffee ready? Okay. So what we have seen until now in this second part is the are you recording? Fine? Okay. Is the structure, how to build the structure of the text. And then now I will give you some practical ideas on how to actually write. So we're going from a macroscopic to a microscopic vision. So some general ideas or things to keep in mind when writing is obviously the same idea I said before, that is, readers usually don't have time, are not concentrated. Maybe they are reading your article in an iPad or in a tablet or in a mobile, in the tube, and so it is really essential to be easy, to be clear, to go to the spot, and make life and make reading as easy as possible for your reader. This doesn't mean that you have to dumb down the issues. You can, an interesting rule of the thumb is to imagine that your reader is infinitely intelligent but infinitely ignorant. So you don't need to dumb down the issues. You really can explain complex things, but you have to build it from the ground, from zero, okay? And then key, I would say, ethical issue when you are doing journalism is accuracy. A good journalist is really something that is obsessed with details, obsessed with facts, obsessed with the idea of giving exact data. If you give a number, if you give a name, if you give a figure, it must be accurate, okay? How to obtain this? Basically, when you introduce a complex concept, a new idea, the best way to introduce it, rather than giving the idea and then giving the example, is the other way around. Starting with the practical metaphor, with the practical example, with the practical anecdote that will convey the intuition, and then go to the general concept. So for example, this is a sentence of Gaitalese, which explains what Liechtenstein is, an Alpine princedom with 15,000 citizens and 5,000 cows that is so tiny that his telephone book is just 3 pages. So he's giving a few practical data that tells you a lot about what Liechtenstein is. Using metaphors, anecdotes, examples is also a moment in which you can convey your point of view on the issue, your opinion, let's say, on the issue. So it's not only a means for making things more understandable, but it's also a tool for conveying meaning, okay? And another important thing is when you introduce data is to use comparisons. So for example, usually data on their own, their data are very difficult to understand, especially if they are big numbers, but they become much easier to understand if you compare with something. So 15,000 square meter buildings, it's equivalent to 5 tennis pitches. 13,000 kilometer trip is the distance between London and Tokyo, and it's always useful, and it's something that when you get used to it becomes automatic, is that when you give a number, you automatically give a term of comparison that humanizes the number, that gives the dimension, real dimension, everyday dimension of the number. So, what are words and sentences that do work when we write this kind of text? First of all, short sentences. So, avoid subordinate clauses. If you have a sentence with many subordinates, it's better to split it with the full stops and make a series of short statements. It will look like telegraphic communication, it's no problem. I mean, journalism is not literature. Journalism is conveying information, okay? Never use I and we unless in very specific occasions. It is common when you are popularizing things to talk about our world, our country, our whatever, but if you say this, you are implicitly conveying the idea that the reader shares with you your social class, nationhood, or whatever, which is an assumption that it's not necessarily true. Obviously, in very specific kind of features, it is allowed to use the I to tell the story in first person, but it's really an exception. Adjectives are another critical thing. It's better to use them only if they are really useful to, if they are essential, if they are really essential to convey an idea. And in general, things like a lot, a few, big, small, are really not relevant for an article. It's much better to give a number and use a comparison. So 13,000 kilometer trip, it's not a long trip. It's a trip as long as a trip from London to Tokyo, which is much better, okay? Much more comprehensive. Present tense and, past tense and complicated tenses or passive should be avoided because they make reading difficult, and also impersonal expressions, because really when you say it is thought, people think, and people say, no, I mean who thought, who thinks, who says, who has announced something, okay? Quotes are very interesting because they give another opportunity to convey interpretation, to convey meaning, to convey context about what you are explaining. While if you're writing news, usually you don't use a language that conveys opinion, quotes can help to provide this content, provide this interpretation. However, not any quote, not whatever quote is useful. For example, if a quote is trivial, if it's obvious, if it's long, if it's boring, it's much better to avoid it. On the contrary, usually quotes are interesting if they express a concept, an idea in an original way, in a non-trivial way, in a way that changes things, changes the vision of things. If you're writing features, quotes are essential. I mean, it's a key piece of feature, but if you're writing more informative pieces like news or press releases, you should only stick to the real essential ones. Another thing that I mentioned already before of quotes is that they are useful to improve the flow of an article. So for example, if you have a long paragraph, for example, with many packed with concept, sometimes it is useful to break it with a quote because it avoids the attention of the reader to fall down through the reading of the paragraph. And then, very practical thing, usually when you write a quote, after that you write says Michele Catanzaro, and if you have many quotes, it can happen that you have an article riddled with the says. So it's better to use synonyms like claims, declares, maintains, replies, states, suggests. Then there are sentences or words that don't work, that it's better to avoid. So first of all, technical jargon. In one of the articles that we will work on, there are expressions like subjectification or things like this that, I mean, if you're writing in an article for the general public, it will kill your reader, I mean, instantly. So either you rephrase it, okay? So either No, it's okay. It's okay in the paper. But really, either you rephrase it, or if you really think it is important, which it can be. I mean, depending on the objective, it can be of your article. It can be really important that your reader learns that subjectification is an important thing that matters for understanding the issue. Then you can use it, but you really need to explain it. It's completely absurd to use an expression like this in an article without explaining it immediately, because it will create a hole in the comprehension of the reader. Then, generic expression like experts agree that, etc., etc., etc. No, what expert, when, what they agree. So, for example, in 2011, instead of writing experts agree that, it's better to write when the agency showed in a report that, etc. Then obviously rhetoric sentences or useless connections like it is well known that, one can easily see that, naturally not experts agree on this point, these kind of things, better to avoid them. People will understand the connection even if you don't write a sentence like this. If you say an opinion in a paragraph and then you say that other experts have another opinion, it's not necessary to explicitly state, and now I will tell you the other opinion. Euphemisms as well are complete bullshit. So, for example, the company is experiencing challenges in its positioning and will carry on a rationalization. No, the company is losing money because people don't buy its products and will fire a certain number of employees. And if you put the number, it's better than saying that it will fire And then obviously there are hideous expressions that journalists use, like, you know, when an accident is described as a battlefield, or things like automatic couplings of words, like alarming report or brutal murder. I mean, every murder is brutal, obviously. And if you are talking about a report, it is likely that it is alarming. Or useless adjectives like serious danger. I mean, if it's a danger, it's a danger. That's it. And also this is something that I hate, especially are trending words that suddenly become trendy and everybody uses it, which is, especially in the Italian press, is something that is especially drives me crazy. Okay, so now we are almost to the end. Just a few suggestions that relate only to one part. I mean, some of you would be interested in writing themselves, but in the case you have to face journalists, to speak with journalists, this is some messages that as a journalist I would like to give you. First of all, I mean, there are bad professionals, but I can say that most of the times, if you become a journalist, especially in this time in which it is so difficult to make a living out of it, usually it's because you want to do your job well. So if a journalist comes to you, it would be very interesting. I mean, it would be very important on our side to help them to do their job, to commit with with helping them, because this will help yourself. One very important thing is timing. An experience that I have with certain researchers is that I write an email on Monday saying, okay, I want to ask you about this, and then I receive an answer on Friday saying, okay, now we can talk, when the article has been published 3 days before. So it's better to acknowledge immediately that you have received the contact, and either you answer immediately, or at least you ask the journalist what is his or her deadline, and you agree and respect it. You agree on the deadline and respect the deadline for your answers. An important thing is try to think in advance what is the mindset of the journalist, and what are the kind of things that he or she will be looking for. So if you want to convey a message, rephrase it in the ways, or frame it in the formats that journalists will like. So they will like stories, they will like conflicts, they will like figures, they will like anecdotes, curiosities. So if you want to talk about your research, it is interesting even to take notes about these kind of things that you can use, let's say, rhetorically, to attract the attention of the journalist and to help him or her to write his story. Creativity is very useful. If you don't have, for example, a specific example, maybe you can use a metaphor that will convey the idea of what subjectification, let's say, is without making it clearer, okay? Honesty and try avoiding to oversell your research is always useful, because it's better to say, if you don't know the answer to a question, to say, I don't know, than to make up an answer that in the end will come out to be false. Because really the best thing that you can build with a journalist is trust, is that he or she thinks that you are a good source, and in the long run this will allow you to have even more access, because once you become a good source, it may even be that you pitch a story or that you suggest a story to the journalist. One important thing is the off-the-record thing. In certain cases, you may want to communicate to a journalist something that is really sensitive without saying that, without making public that you are the source of this. This doesn't mean, even if the journalist says, okay, I will keep it off the record, this doesn't mean that he or she can rediscover this with another source, okay? So, obviously, if you agree that he or she will not quote you on this, it's okay, but this doesn't mean that the journalist can rediscover the thing with another source, that the fact is not told in the story. I don't know if this is clear. Then, sometimes people, and this is something that is horrible, ask you, okay, now I've given you the interview, give me a copy of your text before it's published. This is forbidden. I mean, everybody has interests, also scientists, also researchers have interests, and when they see their declarations in context, they may become scared and they may retract what they have said. So it is not ethical to do this. If you have said something, it is essential that it is quoted correctly, but you cannot change it afterwards. Okay? And then what I said before, once you have established a relation with a journalist, the best thing that you can do for him or her is to become a source for him or her. That is, journalists sometimes don't have time to follow how a story evolves over time. So if you help him or her, if you call when something new happens, if you send a quick email, maybe 9 out of 10 times this will be useless and there will not be space for covering this, but 1 over 10 may work. Okay? Yes, please.
Can you come back to the slide? Because I maybe have some problem with help them to find what they look for.
Yeah.
Because I think it's too mild toward journalists or too obliging. Because sometimes I think as a researcher we should even train the journalist on the topic. I'll give you an example because I have been guiding some journalists in Campania and every time it happened, first we had to have 1 hour in which I was trying to break all the stereotypes that as journalists they have on the issue, because these are the things that go around in the media, these stereotypes about it. So I was trying also, to help them, but not to please them. Okay, like to challenge them, and in order so that they can write something more. Different from the
topic.
Yes, on that topic. Because I think took my role as a researcher.
Yeah, definitely. No, that is very wise from your point of view. What I am saying is that in the end, after this, they have a finite number of tools they can use to tell the story. Okay? So for example, they will always want to have a human story to tell. Okay? So it's okay to criticize and break the stereotypes and maybe give another interpretation of the stories they have already told. But it's even better if you can provide them with another story, another human story that conveys your message. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
That is, the parts destruens is okay, criticizing is okay, but it's even better if you can provide them with a set of tools that allows them to tell the story correctly. Because in the end, they will look for these things. Either if you give them these things or not. So it's better that you give them, you have, these weapons ready to give them, and you keep more control on this. And you help them really, it's not a matter of manipulating journalists, it's a matter of really helping them to tell the right stories. And not maybe the stories that are stereotypical and that everybody looks at. Okay? Yeah. This is what I meant. Okay. But I definitely think that keeping your role as a scientist and being strict on the rigorous concepts that you want to convey, that it is very useful. It's something that,
Yeah, a question.
There was a person behind, and then
sorry.
Then I go to you.
My question is about the copy of an article before it is published.
Yeah.
In several occasions in Turkey, it happened with us, with some projects, or with the news about our agroecological food consumption cooperative, that if journalists cut your statements and then with the text they include, it can really become a totally another format and a totally other argument. So would you suggest any way to negotiate it? Because it's very important how to formulate the sentences.
Okay, first of all, what is completely right is to ask to be quoted accurately. It's forbidden to modify a quote at least in a way that changes the meaning of the quote. If if you take away a mistaken word or whatever, it's okay, but if you change the meaning of the quote, so this is something that if the journalist doesn't do it, it's a mistake. And then, quoting accurately means also quoting in the context. That is, you cannot, if you are saying a sentence with a certain intention, it cannot be that this sentence is decontextualized and used to convey another intention. And sometimes journalists do this, and it's a bad thing, and the matter is that probably it's not a good journalist, okay? But what I stress is that it is not that you are the owner, let's say, of the true version of the facts. The journalist may go to another source or another stakeholder which has a different vision, and the article has to convey the different versions of the facts. So asking to read the article in advance, it's like, if I interviewed a politician and the politician told me, okay, I am involved in a corruption case, or say something that implies that he's involved in a corruption or she's involved in a corruption case. Obviously, if I show the article to him or her before, he or she will say, hey, no, I haven't said this, even if I have it and I have recorded it. So maybe one thing that it is good to ask, for example, is to have the interview recorded, so that you can refer to something documented in case there is a problem. And then, the thing that I was saying, that is trying to build trust and to build a relation with journalists, is something useful also, because first of all, you understand what kind of journalist you are dealing with. So, for example, if you know that this person is not accurate, it's ideologically biased, it's not a matter of not giving the interview, but maybe you can be very, you can give the minimal statements in such a way that you defend yourselves. Instead, if you build trust, if you build a relation, then you have enough feedback with the journalist to be sure that he or she understands what you want to say. It's not easy. The fact is that we cannot, the fact that some journalists are not good professionals cannot imply that we submit our publications to the sources. In the end, one very important thing is that who signs the article is the journalist. So even the quotes that are included in the articles are a report of the journalist. Even legally, at least in Italy and I think in Spain, if there is a legal issue, it's the journalist who has to take the responsibility, not the source, okay? So, that's it. Okay, so here are some books that I've used that are behind the three presentations. So sorry, you have a
No, it was the same question.
Okay, fine. So the first one is an Italian book, but it is translated in Spanish, but I think it's not translated in English, so I'm sorry for that. And this is about, let's say, the first part of the presentation, that is how the context of journalists, how it works. Then this very beautiful book, okay, I put it in Spanish, but it's the original one is in English. It's the Universal Journalist. It's a very nice manual for writing. I would definitely advise to read it because it gives a lot, in a very expanded way. It gives advice about how to write text. Then there is this interesting book by Nick Davis, who is the head of the investigative section of The Guardian, which again explains a lot about those biases that I explained at the beginning. Flat Earth news, the concept is that maybe nowadays, if one would issue a press release saying that the Earth is flat, several magazines would publish it, or outlets or newspapers would publish it because they have really little time to double check. Then this is an interesting publication by the European Environmental Agency, Late Lessons from Early Warnings, which is a collection of case studies in which the precautionary principle was used correctly or not. And then this is in Spanish, is a summary of the story of environmental journalism in Spain. Okay, so thanks. Let us go to the exercise. If you don't have more questions. More questions?
Maybe if you can spend some words on the difference between a newspaper article and blogs. Like about the structure or the scope, let's say, or the public.
Well, I mean, originally blogs are not strictly journalism. Usually they are made by people voluntarily, they convey opinion, they don't imply necessarily an investigation before. It's only from time to time, really rarely, a blog is a piece of investigative journalism, okay? So first of all, it's a difference in intention. Sometimes newspapers or outlets have set up blogs that are explicitly journalistic, but it's just a matter of format. I mean, they are newspaper articles published in a blog, okay? At the level of the style, I would say that what blogs allow is blogs are a good way of placing yourself as a source. If you have a blog, it's a nice way in which you become a source to the journalist. The journalist can see that you are expert in the field, okay? And at the level of style, I would say it's closer to an opinion article than to a feature or a
yeah, actually my question was also related to the fact that blogs are increasingly used by, let's say, journalists on the ground sometimes, let's say. So not professional journalists, but like activists or experts or students, because of course the internet is opening up the more communication tools, let's say, for spreading news, and also blogs are more immediate, right? More, everybody can own a blog, so you can publish it right away, so you don't need to go through all this. But they can be influential somehow.
Yeah.
So if you, I mean, it's a source of, or it's a way of doing kind of journalism, maybe another type of journalism, but a kind of journalism which I think, at least we in our field, we should pay a lot of attention.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a what blogs and what the internet have brought is an expansion of the sources. So for example, if you are already expert in the field, expert not only as a scientist, maybe you're expert because you're an activist or because you are a victim of a situation and you have a lot of information, putting it on a blog is something that maybe before you couldn't do, you didn't have a platform, and you become a source. But making the step of doing a journalistic job is another thing, because if you want to do a journalistic job, it means that you have to invest a lot of work in doing an investigation, you have to talk with many different sources, and these kind of things. So it's something that usually bloggers don't do, simply because of the fact that they don't have time to do it, okay? They don't have money to do it, because really, to do this kind of job, you need a lot of time, a lot of resources to do an investigative job, okay? So I would encourage people to do this kind of things, especially if they have a control of information that would otherwise be obscured. Okay. More questions?
I just had, it's in response to this as well, is that I think I've had the experience writing for a blog that a magazine contacted me, the New Internationalist, contacted me to write an article. So I think this can be something that's really useful for a blog, is that it helps people, somebody that's a journalist that was an editor of the magazine, then contact to say, can you write an article for us?
That is what I was saying. I mean, that it's a way of placing yourself as a sort of positioning yourself as somebody that knows a lot about it. So, I mean, it can even be that you break news sometimes, because you are the first one to give a news, but it's only really from time to time. I don't think it's the job of a blogger to be a journalist. It's another thing, is to convey more interpretation, opinion, to bring to light information. Okay? Okay, so the exercise is the following issue. What are the things that I have to bring in to explain? So what are the antecedents? What are the string of facts that bring to this fact? What are the events that will relate to this fact in the close future? So for example, if you are, for this future, if you are talking about, let's say, something related to climate change, and there will be a meeting on climate change in 1 month, it is very important to bring this into the article. What is the related research, and obviously what is the framing, the possible ideological framing or political framing of the issue. Then, once you have this information in mind, a paradigm that is used in journalism to order the information is the so-called inverted pyramid paradigm. If you're writing a scientific paper, usually you start with a background and then you develop an argumentation that reaches the conclusions, the results, the original part of your work. In journalism, the perspective is completely the opposite. You start with the result, you start with the news things, you start with the conclusions. The newspaper, this is a journalist, and he is asking him to read the beginning of his article. Okay? Okay, I don't know if you have understood it, but basically he's reading this, the lead of the article, the beginning of the article, and he's saying, okay, there has been a shooting, these people have died, and the director says, and don't you mention the Examiner, which is the newspaper that has discovered the story, and he said, wait, I will put it in the second paragraph, and the answer of the director is, who the hell is going to read the second paragraph, okay? So this is something that is interesting to keep in mind, really, who the hell's going to read the second paragraph? You may write a very long feature, but maybe people will read the title, the subheads, the subheads, and that's all, and maybe the first paragraph, okay? So this is a practical and cynical way of okay, so this is a completely different part. It's a very practical set of advice for writing effective text. And the idea is to keep it in mind for the exercise afterwards, okay? So, first of all, what I said to her, I don't know your name, okay, before, that is, you learn to write by writing. So being a journalist is really kind of a craftsmanship. You don't theoretically learn how to do a chair or to make a chair. You learn it by making chairs. And I think journalism is the same. This is why internships are very useful. In my opinion, they are more useful than, for example, journalism masters, because they really give you the practical tools, okay? So before putting yourself at writing, and this I think is very important for the kind of thing that you write, is try to identify specifically what you want to talk about. It is very easy when you are dealing with complex problems to ending up wanting to explain the more general, the broader perspective, but sometimes it's not a good strategy. You really need to talk of one subject at a time to convey a clear message, and then there will be other occasions other opportunities to talk about other issues. Then always before putting yourself at writing, two important things are the following. First of all, how I will write the story, how I will build my narration. There are different strategies. One very easy one is the chronological one, that is arrange the facts you want to tell in a chronological sequence, but there are other strategies that may be very relevant for the kind of subjects you cover. For example, not following a chronological sequence, but a sequence of locations. So something more similar to a movie. First you explain what's happening in one place, then in another place, then in another place. Other possible strategies are a logic argumentation, so you don't follow the chronological evolution, but the logic relation between elements, or a simple list, okay? And then, always before writing, it is very important to identify the relevant context. That is, I want to explain this subject. You start with the message you want to give, and then, in the end, you go to the background, okay? This is a very practical way of thinking when you want to put the information in order in an article. So from the more interesting things, from the newer things, from the more attractive things to the less ones, okay? This could even be applied at a microscopic level. That is, if you have a set of things that you want to say, a practical way of ordering them is saying which is the more attractive one, which is the thing that it's newer, which is the real message that I want to give. I will say it first. Okay? And then I will explain the background. Okay, now I wanted to show you a short movie, a piece of movie that explains, that tells a lot about what is the logic. It is taken from the front page, a very famous movie by Willy Wilder. I hope you will hear it. I close the door just a second. So they are in the newsroom and they are discussing about an article. So this is the head of the